Hey everybody, I'm Stalnaker with Hub Culture, and we are at the Hub Culture Climate Pavilion with Hedera in sunny Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt for COP27. Joining me now is Carl Ganter, who is the founder and managing director of Circle Blue, an old friend of Hub. It's great to have you back here at the Egyptian Pavilion to talk about a very important thing, which all humans need, water. Talk to us about why you're here at COP27 and what your water message is.
Well, Stan, it's obviously always great to be with Hub and with you and what you've done. Water, of course, is slightly personal for all of us. I'm about 75 to 80% water myself, and I hope you are too. And so the reason we're here at a climate conference, right, is water truly is climate, or climate is water. So we're talking about climate change, we're talking about climate negotiations, we're talking about impacts, floods, droughts, we're talking about water. And so that's why I'm here, because we have this intersecting narrative. Usually the water people are over here and the climate people are here talking CO2. Over here we're talking H2O. So now let's bring them together and really start aligning the narrative so that when people are talking about climate change and the public kind of glazes over, we have drought in the American West. We have heat waves in China. We have droughts in Europe. That affects everyone, and they can visualize it and feel it, rather than say a level of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Well, water is, next to oxygen, probably the most universal need that we have. But
yeah.
There's so many different areas of this conversation around water. So let's zero in on a couple of those things. In the American West, there seems to be a growing sense that we're in a water crisis. There's a 1,000-year drought that has been afflicting the area from California through the Southwest and even up into the Rockies. What's your prognosis on the water situation, particularly the Colorado Basin?
Yeah, well, you're really right. It's a 1,200-year drought. Some scientists have said we shouldn't even call it a drought. We should call it an aridification, which is another long buzzword, but which means that we are seeing some major shifts. So I flew Lake Powell over the summer at sunrise, and you could see that chalk line. It was almost down 200 feet. And so Lake Powell, Lake Mead, some of the largest reservoirs in the nation, they could become what are called dead pools, which means they don't even generate electricity, they just flow through. And so...
But that's 40% of LA's electricity.
It's a huge amount of electricity. There are 6 million people who rely just on Lake Powell's power supply. So the Colorado River truly is that blue thread. That's why you're able to grow wheat, you're able to grow hay, other crops in the desert outside of Phoenix. So that whole region relies on the Colorado River. What we're seeing now is a major reset. And what I think we're going to see over the prognosis is it's not necessarily going to get better as far as water supply goes. What we have to do is get better on water use.
So this is effectively a permanent change. And how much is that permanent change a result of climate change?
Right. So as far as climate change goes and permanent, I don't know that any scientists would say permanent. I'm from the Midwest, so we tend to waffle a bit. So we also tend to be more hopeful. Mm-hmm. But as far as climate change, definitely,
but the
definitely
trend line,
an impact.
The trend line is not.
The trend line is not good.
Yeah.
The trend line is definitely very disturbing. What we have to do though is this comes down to using a moment, right? So we have a moment of transformation, and this is when old interests, 100-year-old water rights, where use it or lose it, right? So I'm going to flood irrigate in the desert to grow hay. Okay, that might have sounded great if there was plenty of water. But why are you using that water right today to grow hay in the desert? Does that even make sense? So we have the status quo of this kind of Godzilla versus Mothra battle. Status quo, I can never remember who was the good guy in those, but status quo, old history, water rights versus an entire new future of, say, precision agriculture, drip irrigation, basically measure every drop.
Just out of curiosity, what's the difference of water consumption from a drip point of view versus like a flooding? I imagine it must be vast. Like
it's
1,000x, 10,000x.
It's vast. I don't know what the number is. I'd love to know, but literally measuring, monitoring every plant. Mm-hmm. And so when a plant's thirsty, it puts up its hand and gets some water, rather than just flood irrigating, which we see still today in Arizona.
Right. So this aridification that you talk about is also seemingly strong through California and even up into Oregon and the American Northwest. So, we're seeing fires for the first time in the Cascades this summer, which is quite disturbing. As we move farther east, the water situation changes because as a result of climate change, they're actually expecting more water in some areas of North America, flooding the Mississippi Delta, that kind of thing. How are you seeing the water situation on that side of the country as opposed to the west?
So right now, as we speak, of course, the Mississippi is at incredibly low levels. And so transportation's affected on the Mississippi. And some of the things we've talked about before is concentration of contaminants from, say, agricultural runoff is also another piece.
So when you say that, what you're saying is the water table is dropping and the pesticides and other things from
actually
farming
concentrate.
And so what is the result of that?
So let's talk about the central U.S. and the Ogallala Aquifer, which runs really from North Dakota down all the way down to northern Texas. This is the groundwater supply. So when you fly over central U.S., you look down and you see these crop circles, right? These irrigation circles. In the middle is a well. Think about that well as a straw going deep underground into this aquifer. That aquifer is actually shrinking. And so as it shrinks then, the years of pesticides and years of fertilizers are concentrating. And so what we've seen is communities, particularly in Nebraska, and on basically sitting on top of that central U.S. area, with high levels of childhood cancer, which is really heartbreaking. The piece of that, though, is that we're seeing that communities that have been very protective about their way of life are starting to see that this is becoming a health issue. So you have overuse of water, you have impacts of climate change, and you have kind of embedded processes of outdated embedded processes of agriculture that are starting to affect people directly.
So as we wrap up here, these are some pretty big issues, and we've only talked about the U.S., let alone the rest of the world, which I know there are massive water issues everywhere. There's a real, I think, reluctance from people to look at privatization of water as being a solution because it feels like it should be a public good or it should be a human right to have access to water. Do you see any solutions for some of these problems? Are they intractable? Like, what are you looking at as being ways that we can solve for some of these problems? And do you see the market going towards privatization? And what does that mean?
So as far as privatization goes, that's a whole big can of worms. But the UN, has certified a human right to water. And so usually when you talk about privatization, it's more about around the utilities and distribution and around the systems to distribute it. It's not actually about controlling the drop of water itself.
So water is a public good, but access to water is a private thing?
Delivering it depends. So that starts to get nuanced also. How much water do you need to survive as human? Also talk about our natural systems too. That is embedded in the human right to water. So that it does get complicated, but there are certain structures for tiered pricing, whether it's a public utility or private utility. It used to be, so the more water you use, the cheaper it got. Didn't make any sense. But what gives me hope, though, is that water is having a value, and I talk about value economically, but also around values. And so when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the global commons, we're talking about these grand challenges, water is the one thing that really does connect them. And so the more that we connect to it, the more we'll drive for solutions. And those solutions are really at scale, are really policy solutions. We have most of the technology we need for treating water, for delivering it.
But is good policy going to solve a dry Colorado River?
It's not going to solve putting more water in the river, perhaps, but it may solve taking less out.
Right.
And using that water much more efficiently, because that's the problem. And the one other point here is when we're talking about climate mitigation, right, CO2 mitigation and reduction, if climate change is about mitigation, water is all about adaptation. Like you said, droughts, floods, fires. How do we adapt to a changing climate with the water we have? And that's the hopeful part of that is with that added pressure is we will be fixing, we will come up with new ways in implementation of regenerative agriculture, how to grow more food with less fertilizers, less pesticides, sustainably, how to generate our energy without using so much water. So that's what gives me hope.
Carl Ganter, the water whisperer. Welcome to Egypt. We hope you enjoy the hub, and thanks for this insight as we kick off. We're going to be talking with Carl for a podcast episode for the Hub Culture Chronicles, which you can catch anywhere you get your podcast, where we're going to dive deep on these issues for water
Quite literally.
over a 45-minute conversation later in the week. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Dan.